Hello.
Hi.
I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say, but when mathematics is taught worldwide, everybody is taught the same thing. How do we approach a teaching of religious diversity and so on? You get the gist of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you're pushing me and poking and saying, okay, well, if you say, right, that the claim for state neutrality in issues of science or in math, which we would track in a certain way, and of course has been the object of debate, what neutrality in teaching science in the United States in a certain setting looks like, right? So it's not that that's not contentious, but it's contentious in a way that we don't fold into a debate about neutrality really in law. You say, okay, well, when you come to religion, that seems much more fraught, isn't it? And you're absolutely right, it's much more fraught. And yet, right, the argument here is that that's actually the focal point for the challenge, which is how you go about teaching religion in a manner that is legitimately and genuinely about opening up difference and not perspectival on how to live a particularly good life. The case that's actually drawing this out, and the reason your question is such a good one, is the Loyola College case, which I said was this companion case. And let me give you the facts of that so you can understand this is exactly where the court has been pushed, right? So the SL case takes me to where I brought us, and the next question is precisely your question. And so the Loyola case, which has taken the court now almost a year from hearing, is a case in which the same issue was at play, the Education and Religious Cultures course, Ethics and Religious Cultures course. And yet instead of it being a claim from parents that they should be exempted from having their children involved in that course, which would be taught in this non-perspectival way in public schools, right, to which some people's reaction says, if you don't like that, send your child to the religious school. Right? The Loyola College case is the case of a Catholic high school which has statutory permission in Montreal to teach the whole of their education from a Catholic perspective. Right? They're engaged by the state, they execute the mandate, and they're subject to the Ethics and Religious Cultures course. They have to teach ethics and religious cultures. And they say, fine, we're happy to. In fact, we have for a long time. But what do you mean we have to teach it neutrally? What does it mean to teach ethics and religious cultures in a Catholic high school from a non-perspectival way? And the Ministry of Education in Quebec said, and so they said, surely we're exempted from that. We can teach our world religions and our history from the perspective of Catholicism. I mean, it's a Catholic school, right? The crucifix on the wall and the life of the school. And the Quebec government said no. Said you must teach it from a non-perspectival position, right? You cannot take a stance. So there would be this life in the school of Catholicism infusing the education throughout and the activities, but then for an hour a week, right, there would be this bracketing of the Catholic. And so this is the case that's before the Supreme Court of Canada now, which as you can see is a much more difficult case than SL. Because the argument is there is only one way to teach religious difference and ethics and religious cultures. That's what the Quebec government is taking as a stance. There is but one way. And so I think your question is an excellent one because my worry about the Loyola case is that the argument that you should teach religious difference and comparative religion, right, might turn into an argument that there is but one way to teach it. And I think that's a big difference when it comes to teaching about religion and equipping children for difference. I think it's the case that there are multiple ways of arriving at a good education about religious difference, but the exposure to religious difference and to religious history, that's a different matter. And so maybe I'm a bit elliptical on the point, but you put your finger exactly on what's before the court right now.
I'd just like to ask you a little more on this question of neutrality in teaching religion. I think that's a key issue here, especially in light of this notion of the secular state being neutral. If you have a close look at the Quebec curriculum, I would suggest that neutrality, or teaching in a neutral fashion, really equates to teaching religion superficially, quickly. Because if you look at the curriculum, it's not just sort of like conventional religions, Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism. You're supposed to also cover, say, indigenous spiritualities and religions, which are very different. Throw in secularism, that's part of the curriculum. So what happens on the ground is, and this is Andrew Wright's point from the United Kingdom, is when the secular school teaches religion, it does it in a very sort of secular way, but in a superficial way that doesn't do justice to the claims of religious groups. So how do you possibly cover the ground in a way that encourages further learning, questioning, when there's so much ground to cover?
So it's an important point, and I think you're led from the position, if you come to the argument that there is a mandate or a justifiable mandate to teach about this, there's absolutely the question, which I think is the heart of your point, how do you do it well? Right? So you could say it ought to be taught. How do you do this well? And whether the ERC is a good example of education about the varieties of religious cultures, or it's a poor example of that, I think education scholars and pedagogical designers are much better equipped to do so. But the issue I have the concern I have is this, is to say that it's awfully difficult to teach this in more than a superficial way, which I think is fair, and lead you to one of 2 points, right? To try and find a way to do it in public schools, or to just not do it at all. And my argument is that the second is not an alternative, right? The second is not a tenable alternative for an education that's seized with this argument that what you're trying to do is to cultivate a capacity for the social world as we find it, right? Not necessarily for how you'd like it to be, or not necessarily about for the claims you have, but something must be done in that. Now, I'm not sure actually how distinctive religion is as a subject matter compared to the very many things that are taught in high schools that are of necessity taught in provocative opening ways but aren't exhaustively dealt with. My suspicion is that it's not in character that seriously different than the way in which history courses and the way in which other topics engage with areas. And so that there's a bit of a fear around engaging with the beginning of education in religion. But the notion that you ought to do it and that it's difficult, I'm not sure that that's a claim that one ought therefore not to have public schools engaging in education around religious difference.
Yeah, but isn't that a strong secular assumption that we can cover religion quickly and efficiently in some fashion, because it's actually fairly straightforward? Now, my point would be it's much more complex than that if you're going to do it in a satisfactory fashion. I mean, Wright talks about this as avoiding the Islam in 2 lessons phenomenon. Because if you follow a curriculum like the Quebec curriculum, that's what happens. Because there's a sense that you have to cover all this stuff. And so you have to do it in a fashion which is like phenomenological. This is just the phenomenon of religion. This is one aspect of it. Next week we're going to look at another aspect of it. And even if that's taught well, you end up with a view of religion that is unrecognisable to the religious person.
Well, the education scholars actually say this is a character of curricularizing anything, right? That you turn it into the object of study rather than into something lived. And I think that that's a criticism that's come up with this in the context of Turkey and education and across the world. Germany is a really active site for this. So in one sense, the argument is, as you begin to curricularize anything, you strip it of reality. Bruno Latour has this phrase to say, if you try and look at anything through law and try and get at life, it's like faxing a pizza, right? You're ending up with something that looks a little bit like it. And your argument is similar. You're saying if you try and teach religion, it's like faxing a pizza, right? You're invariably going to do that. Again, I come back to this point. Education scholars say that's the character of curricularizing anything. I'm not sure it gets you away from the problem of having to teach about the social world in which a child is going to enter. So, is the ERC a good way of doing it? Is it a well-developed curriculum? I'm agnostic on that. I don't know enough about whether it is. But is the object of the state to teach about exposure to multiple religious traditions objectionable on grounds of state neutrality? I think not.
Would you, given that any attempt to make say that you're approaching something from an objective standpoint or a neutral standpoint is in fact just saying you're approaching it from a different standpoint. So regardless of how you approach something, you're going to bring your own biases into it. So neutrality in an absolute sense is impossible. And given that, like, whether you err on the side of one religion or whether you err on the side of atheism or however you're going to err on the side of, as inevitably a teacher will, because it's simply impossible not to. And because it's public and forced education, doesn't that necessarily mean that taxpayers are being forced to give money to a system which is going to actively undermine what they believe to be true? And isn't that, do you think that there's issues in terms of fairness to the taxpayer in that?
So let me sort of, you could push back on me when I attempt to repackage and sort of tame your question around issues to taxpayer, because I'm going to push away from issues to taxpayer, and you might say that's really what I'm most interested in, and fine, I'll come back to that. But let me kind of articulate a concern I have from the perspective of the religious studies side. A lot of these cases and a lot of these claims, and I think this is a habit that happens in law, and a habit that happens when we worry about the ways in which the actions of the attempt to give content on what the social world that you're about to walk into looks like. A little bit of information, which I think, as the last questioner raised, is something that must be cast as a little bit of information and inevitably provisional, as is done across an entire curriculum. There's a tendency to imagine religion and religious communities as incredibly frail, just incredibly vulnerable, in ways that I don't think map good social scientific reflection on the nature and vibrancy of religious communities. And so SL has to come, or the parents have to come in the SL case and say, in essence, that our efforts at teaching at home, our interaction with our children in light of what the state is maybe imperfectly trying to do, right, are so ineffective, and our community so frail and so ineffective in its kind of cultivation of this perspective, so unable to encounter the attempt to deal with this as a curricularized version, that any impingement will meet the end of our tradition. And I think there's a habit, a sort of invitation to overcast religious communities and religious traditions as far more frail than they actually are. And so I'm not sure that that risk, right, of disruption of a child's equanimity at home is is really an informed, reasonable position from which to imagine what children are met with in education. So it's a common refrain, and your question is a good one. It's saying, you know, it happened in the Chamberlain case. One of the major claims was children will be confused, right, when they're met with books about same-sex parented families. Right? The psychological disruption and confusion is just much too much for the child to bear. And the pushback from the court was, you know, children have a greater capacity and a greater resiliency for holding complexity than the argument before us seems to suggest. And I guess my kind of response to your question is, I'd like to see that approach taken with religion too. The nobility and genius of religious cultures, of which I think there are substantial measures, comes when you take a historical account of these traditions from dynamism and change, interaction, and I worry about the use of the law to kind of ossify and sort of frame a kind of paper crane version of these very robust traditions. Taxpayer I haven't talked about at all, but I actually think one of the great gifts we've been given in Canada, and maybe I'll address the taxpayer a bit, is that our jurisprudence, unlike in the United States, is not follow the buck religion jurisprudence. We don't have a non-establishment principle, right? We have freedom from religion, right? We have freedom of religion. But you can learn almost nothing in Canada about the scope of religious freedom and the scope of state-religion relationships by following the dollar. Whereas a whole half of the American jurisprudence on religion is about seeing where the dollar flows, right? Which in my view, is a huge diversion from these kinds of much more difficult claims. So I'm kind of dispositionally a bit skeptical of the follow the buck stuff. We're forced to do all sorts of things, endorse all sorts of things through taxes. I think it's a bit of a diversion.
So, given the time, I think we've got 2 questions here, and if you want to stay, we may be able to take more questions. But
Yeah, a quick comment. You've noted how the question of freedom from religion has creeped in, and that's fairly clear. Is there any sort of hint or recognition that that seems to conflict with freedom of religion? So and it plugs into, I think, your notion of state neutrality. I think you're quite right. That's a very ambiguous notion, and some would say that that is a myth. That there's really no such thing. But it seems that once you push state neutrality, that goes together then, I think, with this sort of notion of freedom from religion. Yeah. But that seems to me directly to impinge on any sense of freedom of religion.
Yeah, the notion that, I think you're right, that the living between freedom of religion and freedom from religion, when you take the point that, objectivity is a kind of, the court has said it's an aspiration, it's always failed in some form, is awkward. But let me say, I think actually, I've said neutrality is a dangerous place unless we're careful about what we mean by it to begin a conversation about the management of religious difference. Your question points to another concept that I think has done a lot of mischief. And it's one that we've kind of heard and that I've invoked more than I like to, which is secularism, right? The notion that there is a principle of secularism. And so people will often begin their reasoning and saying, given the secular state, right? The best research is that what we have are varieties of secularisms that are at best a sort of repertoire of moves that you can have in trying to manage the relationship between religion and public authority. And that what looks like secular in Turkey is fundamentally different than what looks like secular in the United States and Canada, and it has all to do with the historical traumas and passages that you've moved through. And the risk of leaning on claims of the secular is that it says too little. And what do we end up with? We end up with a public debate about the secular, what does it mean to be secular, and Charles Taylor and Gerald Bouchard issuing a report that says we need to understand secularism better. And then the Quebec government passing a charter of secularism, which says, well, I'll tell you what secularism looks like, right? And what it means is actually a form of evacuation of religion that bears no relationship to what the Supreme Court describes as secularism in its recent cases, which bears no relationship to what the court describes as secularism in its early cases. And so secularism is another one of these, I think, distracting ideas that you learn precious little from. And we do far better to do something more like Professor Adams' work, which is to get into constitutional history, to say, what is the configuration of law and religion, rather than what is secularism,
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and I particularly am struck on this neutrality point, and I want to think further about it. But you opened with some, and you've made a few comparative remarks. Yeah. And I guess for me, I'm thinking of countries where you have an established church. Yeah. And it's interesting, and I think particularly the UK jurisprudence, I'm thinking more on the blasphemy cases, but you're also seeing in education as well, where even in a country that has an established church, there's this desire to be neutral. Yeah. Which seems to be contradictory of sort of the history of the state. So
the I don't know if this will be helpful to you, I'll try. When Germans look at the United States, right, they say you have no separation of church and state, right? It's folly. When Americans look at Germany and see the funding of religious institutions and of clerics and there being in the legislature paid for and supported religion, they say you have no separation of church and state whatsoever. And so they both say we do it and you don't, and they're both right? So how is this possible? So when we say, is there an established church, right? I think the crucial question, and England, you're quite right, is a great example, where there's an established church, but it seems to do very little work in terms of its difference in how it then manages religion and religious difference than Canada, right? You can imagine separation between church and state as being a separation between religion and the political and legal, or separation of church and state as the institutional separation of religious institutions and state institutions. And so in Germany, right, the notion of the separation of church and state is you have to keep religion out of political decision-making and legal discourse. But the mixing of institutional relationships is not a problem. And in the US, you must keep the institutions apart, follow the buck. But you can't get elected president unless you talk about God, right? So a huge mixing. And so you're quite right. This is, again, a sort of devil in the details point, that actually the notion of an established church says very little about life on the ground in the English management of religion and education, or religion and public life. Whereas a place like Turkey, which avowedly has no religious establishment, right, has a much, much more fraught relationship with the management of religious symbols and Islam, right, than England does. Yeah. So again, establishment leads us as a starting point to saying, establishment, so what? You know, what is the constitutional life under the establishment? Great question.